All right, so this is my new camera angle for right now in particular. I hope you guys like it. So if you're watching this video because of the title, yes, the title is that I added Python to HTML or was able to run Python through HTML, but I would encourage you to watch the full video in particular. My whole goal of doing that was actually from something else, and the idea of me adding Python to HTML was kind of just something that happened so happenly. The main idea of what I was actually trying to do from the beginning was make a challenge for myself where I would create a reactive framework in Python. Reactivity is really a node's job. Like at the end of the day, you want something that is JavaScript on the back end because the front side is JavaScript as well. If we're talking about what's going to make things reactive, you're always going to need JavaScript because that's the only thing that manages the DOM on the front end. You may have WebAssembly, but JavaScript is really the main way to actually have a reactive framework. And I wanted to shoot myself in the foot with this idea of thinking, hey, I'm not sure why reactive frameworks are only composed of Node. Like, I understand that it's JavaScript, but you could just translate those things on the front side, and that's what a lot of those frameworks do anyway. When you look at the console, you're gonna notice these chunks of information of JavaScript anyway, and those have functions that actually update components reactively anyway. So for me, I'm like, you're gonna need JavaScript on the front end anyway. To me, it doesn't make sense that there is no real way to be able to have reactiveness on the back end. Like there are some frameworks out there, like Blazor is a good example, but it's not something that's really common knowledge or known, or most people will probably try to push you back into using React if you felt that Node ability of backend JavaScript. So I wanted to really punish myself and see what's the worst that can happen. Well, boy, oh boy, was it crazy. The first thing I do is I try to look up to see if there's any projects like this to begin with. Obviously, I don't want to waste my time if this project already exists, right? So I look it up. ChatGPT tells me that there is no project, and I Google it and I don't see any other project on this. More on that later. So with me having this understanding that there is no project like this, it makes a kind of good use. Even if the thing doesn't work out, maybe some other person who's smarter than me could take my code from GitHub and do something better with it. So now we're in the thick of things. I start asking ChatGPT, how am I going to build this reactive framework, right? I know I'm going to use Flask for this reactive framework because for Python and web frameworks, that's my favorite easy to go type of microservice that can handle mostly everything I need. And if I need something extra, I can add an extension along with it. I'd rather not use Django for this just because it adds so many extra things. I'm not really trying to look for that. So I use Flask, and the first thing I think to myself is that we should create some sort of component builder, something that can be added into a route where I can inject in my own components, where I could be able to track them using maybe WebSockets. If I can use WebSockets, I could then have some sort of basic JavaScript on the front side that's able to react to whatever the WebSockets are saying, and I could have custom JavaScript that does that. I work with ChatGPT to basically help me create an reactive element builder component, which is basically just a class in itself. There's a class where I can be able to specify the type of tag it's going to be, along with any other attributes and other properties that it may have, and maybe any other like CSS classes it's going to have. And from that, it will automatically render out the element I had specified. So because of this, we now have something where I can make components that I have control over on the back end. I add in something called a Flask ID because I'm thinking that's what I'm going to call the project. I'm not necessarily sure. And this Flask ID is going to essentially be the lock that I'm going to have connected to the WebSocket, so that anytime a Flask component is made, it automatically has an ID to it that's automatically registered to the WebSockets. Now I can be able to track any actual components that I build off of my component builder. And the first reactive test I do is the same thing that Svelte does. This concept where you could basically hit a counter button and you could see it increase reactively. And so I work on that with ChatGPT, and it actually was really good. I didn't like the way it came out originally, but the actual code works. You have in your class a prop where you could basically be able to add variables to that actual prop in your class for your components, and then you can manipulate that variable. And that seemed great, but I didn't like it because of the fact that that means that every variable I want to manipulate is literally binded to each and every single class or every single specific component. This means that if, for example, I wanted to make a variable that can control multiple components, I would have to make some sort of code that is able to manually attach itself to each and every single component, and that's going to be a lot of overhead over time. So that's obviously not the right way to go about doing this. So I thought to myself, I like my component builder, but it would be good to be able to have actual Python inside of my HTML at the top. The idea being is that if I can render out my actual information for Python first, I could be able to have a variable that's in the backend that could be updated through my Flask components. And so therefore I could be able to specify that specific variable that I had made. And I thought the best place to put it is kind of like the same that you would do in Svelte or Vue or React, where you could put a variable right in the actual file of where your HTML would be, right? It depends on the actual framework. Vue is a great example of this, so is Svelte. And you could be able to have basically a script tag at the top or wherever you want inside of where your HTML would be, and you could be able to run your JavaScript code or whatever. And so I first then think to myself, let's keep the component builder. It's a good idea and it's a good concept. And let's instead do something where we could have some sort of variables initialized at the top of an HTML file. During the rendering of the HTML, it'll read, let's say, a tag that I'll make. Let's call it a Flask tag or whatever. We'll put it inside of the HTML, and at the top of the HTML, we'll basically read out anything that's in that Flask ID tag, and we'll basically run that as Python. And this will allow me to have the backend of the Python for Flask in particular be actually knowledgeable of the variables that are there, right? There's more to it than that. I had to, for example, show or expose out the sys path that would be most likely the place where most people would put their custom code. So therefore, if someone actually decided to use this, they could inject in any of their actual important code from whatever files or folders they want directly into the HTML directly, so that therefore the context of the environment is aware of those variables and modules that can be accessed. And once I understood that, I had ChatGPT start helping me. And the way I was able to do that was by hijacking that render template. So when you're dealing with Flask in particular, you have a render template function that can basically render out an HTML file that usually is in your template folder. So what I did is I hijacked that function by making another function that wraps around this. The idea and goal is that before you actually send off the HTML file over to the render template engine from Flask, what you do is you read the file yourself and you look for anything that is set up as a Flask tag. Inside that Flask tag, you would read all the Python that's in there and you would run that Python, and then you would get rid of the Flask tag from the actual file or whatever you have, and then you would craft over that string that's left over for the HTML over to the actual render template for Flask. So when Flask sees everything, it doesn't see the Flask tag that was added to your HTML file. It's only going to see the rest of the HTML, which it can render properly. And this allows you to, at the beginning of any onload, be able to inject in Python code directly into your instance for Flask if you needed to do anything. And this was great. This was awesome. There was so much more that I wanted to do with this. I was already able to push this to GitHub within the first 5 hours that I really started working on this. And afterward, I started updating, especially after I had changed it so that you could basically read Python from HTML. And I was feeling really good at this point. And this is when I went to social media and kind of posted that I think I had basically accidentally added a way for you to basically run Python through an HTML file. It's pretty cool, as long as you're using Flask. So that's how I essentially did this, right? But what about the framework of this Flask thing that I basically half created or half-heartedly did? What's going to be about that? So about the next day or two afterward, I decide to look again just to double check if there's no reactive frameworks for Flask or Python. I figured that I couldn't have been the only person who just figured this out, and most of the code I figured out in 5 or 6 hours. There's no way I could have been the only person who has done something like this. So I ask again, and Google's Gemini actually tells me that there is a module and program, or app rather, that already exists. It's a Flask extension called Flask Meld, and it is way better than my Flask thing that I made already on GitHub. It does multiple different things that I would have had to take time to do already, that handles a lot of different things that are awesome. For one, it actually is able to connect to its components with WebSockets like I did, but it's able to validate them with CSRF tokens, which you usually use in other websites with mostly .NET to do validation, to make sure you're not getting, like, I think, cross-site forgery in particular. So it's actually really great for validation. And then on top of that too, it actually has some code built in for better DOM manipulation than what I did. For what I was doing, I was directly actually manipulating the DOM, and I knew that I would need something that's able to handle virtual DOM so that I could be able to work with this better in the future. But this person, or the people who worked on Flask Meld, they already are using something called Mofos. And from what I saw on that, it's like a virtual DOM, except it doesn't actually use a virtual DOM. It actually takes the state of what your DOM is right now and represents it in an easy way for it to be able to manipulate and manage it for you. So it's kind of like a real DOM manager that's very lightweight. So this Flask Meld was way better than anything I made, and that would make sense. I spent only about 5 to 13 hours on the whole thing itself. You know, like, at the end of the day, that's going to be better. However, there's some potential opportunities here that I think are really useful for my next up and coming videos. For one, this Flask Meld has not been updated in 2 or 3 years. You know, so if there's anything going on in particular as far as issues or whatever, I could be able to look into that and see if I could help. Not also that, a lot of the things that I was doing for Flask could be added to Flask Meld as an add-on or as some sort of extra GitHub repo push or something like that if they decide that my code is good. For one, the way they build components, you have to build like a class file and kind of specify things inside that class in a specific way, right? However, my component builder gives someone an extra way to be able to build reactive components where you could basically add them not just from a file that would be a class, but also inside the route itself or inside the HTML file, and basically gives you more freedom of where you want to place out your reactive components. And then on top of that, the main biggest feature that I can add to Flask Meld is the ability to be able to run Python directly in the HTML file. If not added to Flask Meld, maybe make it its own extension for Flask where you could basically be able to use this extra feature for whatever you need. So there's a lot of potential from the actual learning and things that I've done, even though I decided to try to shoot myself in the foot by seeing how bad it would be to kind of create a reactive framework for Python. I was able to have so many cool things come from this, from creating Python in HTML that can be ran, from being able to create my own component builder, to understanding more of how the reactive framework works. And so I hope you enjoyed this video in particular. My next one about this will be more about what happens next. And if you're interested in the speed run or the actual video, full video for this whole thing, I have it on my YouTube now. You can click in the link in the description below. And other than that, I hope the rest of your day goes well. Peace, everyone.